Hi, church. Today we continue our series on the Gospel of Mark. Remember to join us for the church-wide Zoom at 10 a.m. for discussion, prayer, and fellowship. Now, you may have already picked this up about me, but I'm one of those weird type of people who actually like school, who actually like to study. And now it's not everything about school that I like. I'm not a big homework guy or anything like that. But there are parts of school that I enjoy and study, and I look back on those days for the most part fondly. Um, in fact, I'm even the type of person who gets a little bit of excitement reading through the course catalog, right? The course catalog, that list, maybe it's online, maybe it's a book you flip through, but it lists all the courses a school offers, all the subjects, and gives a description of them. I remember reading through those and getting a bit excited at some of the courses. I don't do this anymore, but as a college student, as a seminary student, as a maybe a senior in high school, thinking about colleges, finding these course catalogs and reading through some of the course descriptions, I'd get excited about the possibility of learning these new things. Who the professor was, what time period was talked about in this class, and maybe even the books covered. I'd get excited reading through some of those. Now, it wasn't all of the course descriptions. Certain courses were more interesting to me than others. For example, the intro level courses weren't something that I was getting excited about, not the, just sort of the gen ed basic things. But when you get to the course descriptions in the course catalog of some of the advanced higher learning things, that's where I start to get excited. Not because in some arrogant way I thought I was advanced or something, but because in some of those courses you could really seem like be really interesting and intriguing stuff, and it seemed like you'd be in a smaller setting and really get to learn and dig deep into some content areas. So I was interested in learning about things like psychology, but it wasn't intro to psychology that really caught my eye. It was a class called group psychology. And for example, I'm really interested in the Bible, but just intro to the Bible wasn't the course description in the course catalog that caught my eye. It was things like the synoptic gospels. At that point, I didn't even know what the synoptic gospels were. So I was like, sign me up. I want to find out. I want to learn more about that. And with theology and history, it wasn't intro to church history that I was intrigued by, but something like theology of the Eastern Fathers. That just sounded important, and I wanted to be a part of it. And so, in my excitement, I was like, "When can I start? What are the books? When can I learn these things that I'm reading about in these course descriptions in the course catalog?" But you know what? As you read through the course descriptions in the course catalog, I get to this word, this really fancy sounding word, that in some ways this word really was a soul crushing, dream crushing word. This fancy sounding word that I'm talking about is the word prerequisites. The prereqs, the prerequisites, those would be listed in the course description in the course catalog as well. And the prereqs are those things that needed to be taken, the courses need to be taken before you could take the interesting course that I was really interested in. They just had to be taken, right? They were prereqs. There was no skipping over them. They were required. They were prerequisites. So in order to get to this good stuff, of course, all the prerequisites were those introductory courses that I wasn't interested in. And so this was that soul crushing, dream crushing thing for this young student who was so interested in the course catalog, only to find out that got to do the prereqs. You got to fulfill those obligations. You got to slog through the big gen ed courses where it just seems like the professor is droning on and on to get to the ones where you read the descriptions and those courses that I was really interested in. What a tragedy, right? And all due to these prereqs, all due to having to fulfill these extra obligations. I couldn't go right to the type of learning that I want. Well, hey, I realize that maybe you don't get excited about course catalogs. Okay, there's a strong likelihood that you do not get excited about course catalogs. I get that. But that doesn't mean you haven't been impacted by prerequisites. Prereqs are a part of other parts of our lives as well, right? Even if you've never opened up a course catalog, you've still been impacted by prerequisites. Because there's things that you've wanted to do, there's things that you've wanted to achieve or acquire or whatever, and they've taken things you've had to do prior to. to qualify as prereqs. The career world is full of prerequisites, as an example. There are lots of requirements usually you have to make before you start a job. Even if you find a dream job, and even if you think it's a perfect fit for you, and you're a perfect fit for this job, and even if somehow you could prove that perfect fitness, you can't just show up one day and say, hey, I'm ready to start. Sign me up. I'm ready to start the job. That's not how it works, right? There are some prereqs that you need to fulfill before you start the job. There's typically some sort of application you need to fill out. That you need to fill out some references along with that application. That's a prereq. There's an interview process that you have to go through. And that could be a major prereq, a major hurdle, because you could be great at the job. You could know you'd be great. But what if you're not great in the interview? Right? What if you stink at interviews? That's a prereq that's going to be hard to fill. And then filling out the resume is another prereq in getting a job. And a lot of times, in addition to your education, maybe some degrees are required on that resume, but you also have to list your experience. And some jobs in their job descriptions list having 2 years experience, 3 years, 5 years experience related in that job field. That can be another prereq that's hard to fill, particularly if you're just starting out, right? If you're just starting out in an area and it's a prereq, if experience is required to get a job, and yet you want to get a job, but you need the experience to get that job, it can be a bit of a head scratcher. How are you going to fulfill that prereq? How are you going to get your foot in the door? So there are prereqs in lots of areas of life. Job experience, schooling is one, and we could list others. But I want to get to our scripture today. I want to get to the Bible and talk about some positions in the Bible that really ought to have had some major prerequisites, some major qualifications in order for them to be filled. We're talking today about the disciples of Jesus, his closest followers. You probably know that Jesus did not do ministry alone. He was not a lone ranger. He wasn't the type that said, I've got to do this all by myself. I've got to do this. And hey, just that idea alone, just the idea that Jesus didn't do ministry alone, that's an important takeaway, right? Because some of us like to do things all on our own, and yet Jesus, the God-man, fully man, didn't do it on his own. He ministered alongside others, and he had disciples and followers. He recruited people to work with him. You probably also know about the disciples that there were 12 of them, 12 disciples. Well, how did this happen? What was the process by which Jesus came to have these disciples? Well, the Bible tells us. The Gospels, Mark being one of them, give us some disciple calling stories. We don't hear how all the disciples were called, but we do get some really interesting stories. In fact, Mark jumps straight to the disciple calling stories right after the introduction to his gospel. Right after we looked at last week the stories of John the Baptist and Jesus getting baptized. And Jesus announces the kingdom of the good news of the kingdom. And right away in chapter 1, Mark goes straight into the disciple calling stories. Okay? And you may remember some of these stories. You may recall that in these disciple reading stories, we read about how Jesus conducts this exhaustive search, right? He's looking for the best of the best. He's searching, and he searches with a fine-tooth comb, pours over all of Israel, all of Judea, searching for the finest religious scholars, the most impressive teachers of the law, the youngest, brightest minds. That's who Jesus wants to be his disciples. And he looks for those who have the best experience that'll help him teach and preach and to work with the crowds. This is how Jesus compiles a list of candidates for disciples, a list that couldn't be beat. And once Jesus has this list of candidates, the best of the best Judea, Israel has to offer in the first century, he sits down with these candidates. He sits down with each of them and he goes over a list of prereqs to be his disciples. Jesus says to these candidates, all right, you've made it to the final interview round, but there are still some prerequisites, some things I still want to make sure you've done in order to make sure I have the best of the best to be my disciples. I want to make sure you fulfill all the prereqs. Do you remember that? Do you remember those stories, those disciple calling stories with all the prereqs? No, of course you don't. Of course you don't, because that's not how it is at all in these disciple calling stories in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus doesn't do an exhaustive search for the best of the best. He doesn't have a long list of requirements or prerequisites. Mark in chapter 1, verses 16 through 20, tells us it was a lot simpler than that. See, because in the stories of the Gospels, especially in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus is calling the disciples, it just starts with Jesus walking, right? The text says he's walking along the Sea of Galilee, this lake near where Jesus grew up and where he spent a lot of his time, and where there were villages and towns that you'd come across. One of the things you'd see if you walked along the coast back then were fishermen. People in their nets getting ready to go out, or coming back and getting their nets ready for their fish, all these kind of things, casting their nets into the sea. We're told that one day Jesus is just walking along the shore and he sees two brothers. He sees Simon, who will come to know as Peter, and his brother Andrew. And they're casting their net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Jesus says to Simon and Andrew, he says, "Come, follow me." And this is that line that we'll never forget. He says, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. I will make you fish for people." That memorable phrase, role reversing phrase that Jesus has. He's going to take these fishermen and make them fishers of men. And Simon and Andrew, they leave their nets and they follow Jesus. We're also told that Jesus walks a little further on that same coast. He sees another set of brothers. He sees James and John, and they're in their boats. They're getting ready to go out fishing. But then Jesus sees them and he calls them. He says, "Come, follow me." And sure enough, James and John, they leave their nets, they leave their father, and they follow Jesus. That's how Jesus called his disciples. He was just walking along the shore of the lake. He saw some fishermen, and he said, "Come, follow me." And guess what they did? They dropped everything and they followed him. There was no interview, no exhaustive search, no experience required, certainly no prereqs. That's how different it is with Jesus. That's how radical. That's how, to use a word we used last week, I told you to expect a bit of weird news with Jesus. His disciple calling process is a bit of weird news, because it's certainly not how we would do it today. I want you to imagine that Jesus came to you today, that Jesus would come to you today and ask for your help searching for disciples, searching for followers. If Jesus came to you and said, "I need your help. I need to find a group of people that I can teach, but that can also minister alongside me and that can take over for me when I'm gone." Imagine if Jesus asked for your help finding those types of people. What would you do? What would you do? I can tell you what you probably wouldn't do. You probably wouldn't just head to the local river or lake and just find some fishermen and say, "Hey, come, Jesus needs some people," right? You'd conduct some sort of search, but it probably wouldn't be at a body of water. You'd probably go to the best schools and the best seminaries and ask for their best and brightest students and say, "Jesus needs you." Maybe you find those who had memorized the Bible or huge portions of Scripture or wowed their professors with their quick learning. You might search the country for young, dynamic preachers who showed a lot of promise, who had a way with words and a captivating presence about them. You'd want to consider experience too, because you'd want to find people who had some experience that they could bring to help Jesus in his ministry. Hey, today maybe you'd launch a reality show called The Preacher, the search for America's top pastors. I don't know. But whatever you do, I'm sure you'd have a list of requirements, a list of prereqs in your searching for disciples for Jesus that would weed out and help you find the best of the best, the cream of the crop. And that shows how different Jesus' approach to calling the disciples really was. It's different from how we would do it today. It's also very different from how it typically worked in Jesus' time, in the first century. You see, Jesus wasn't the first rabbi, the first teacher, the first prophet to have disciples, to have followers. That was actually rather common in his day, that teachers and rabbis would have disciples and people that would follow them. But you know, how it typically worked is those prospective disciples, those students, would seek out the rabbi. They would go to The teacher or the prophet or the rabbi, they place themselves at their feet and say, here are my qualifications. I want to follow you. I want to learn from you. They would go to the rabbi. And then that teacher or rabbi might have a list of prerequisites. They might test them in some way to see if they were really worthy of being their disciple. In the Jewish context, certainly part of that worthiness, part of being qualified, part of the prereqs to being a disciple to a prominent rabbi would be knowing the scriptures, knowing the Torah, knowing what we call the Old Testament. And this goes beyond just knowing about the Old Testament. So, oh yeah, I remember those stories about David. Yeah, I know that. No, these students, these possible disciples would need to have it memorized and had to have some thoughts on these kind of things to present to the rabbi or the teacher. Of course, the more prominent rabbis and teachers or prophets could be a little bit more selective in who they chose. They could have their own list of prereqs of who qualified to be their disciple. But when we read these stories of Jesus calling the disciples in the Gospel of Mark, it works totally different from that. Right? They don't seek Jesus out. He seeks them out and he calls them. That's a radical change. I told you to expect something weird. That's a radical change, not only because Jesus reverses the roles of the student seeking out the teacher, but because here we have Jesus, the master of the universe, calling fishermen. If anyone deserved to have people seeking him out, if anyone deserved the best of the best to come to him and to sit at his feet and say, Master, we want to learn from you, well, certainly that was Jesus. But one of the amazing things about Jesus, one of the amazing things about our God, is that he seeks us out. Isn't that amazing? When he could have stayed in his throne in heaven, he came down and he sought us out without requiring prerequisites. I think that's an amazing thing. Even still, though, you might be wondering, you might read these disciple calling stories in Mark and the other Gospels and ask, why these specific disciples? Why them? Surely Jesus deserved some amazing people with amazing talents, with amazing gifts and abilities and experiences. Instead, Jesus goes with a no prereqs approach. He goes with fishermen and he makes them fishers of men. You know, that makes for a good play on words for a preacher. But I doubt that was very good preparation for the kind of work Jesus was really calling them to do. Imagine today, it'd be like, there's these kids who are really good with Legos. Some of these kids have some awesome Lego sets, and they're even great at building the Legos. And you can be, wow, you did a great job building that. But I doubt you'd go to those Lego building kids and say, hey, I've got a job for you. I've got a house that needs to be built. I want you to build my house. I want you to be on the construction team. Would you do that? Probably not. You'd go with a different prereqs. You'd want to find some qualified people to construct your house, to construct your home. You wouldn't go with the Lego builders. But Jesus goes with fishermen to be his disciples. Now, certainly not all of Jesus' disciples, not all 12 were fishermen. But none of the 12 he called his disciples fit the mold of what a typical disciple candidate would look like in the first century. They're not the people we would choose. They're not the people other rabbis would have chosen. They aren't religious experts or trained public speakers or teachers of the law. None of these men were on the disciple track. None of them had filled what you might list as the possible prereqs for the position. Jesus didn't go to the finest schools or the synagogues or the temple to find some Pharisees or Sadducees or priests. He went with a no prereqs approach. So you still might be wondering, why? Why did Jesus choose them? It's a valid question. Because here in Mark, when he tells us this disciple calling story, we aren't really given any specific description or reason for why Jesus chose them. We aren't told that Simon and Andrew and James and John, we aren't told that they were really smart, or that they were really quick learners, or that they had great memories, or were wonderful people with wonderful relationship skills. Or even, we're not even told that, though they were fishermen, they always had this deep desire to follow God closer. They always had this desire to study the scriptures more. We're not told anything like that. There was nothing remarkable, nothing to set them apart. So again, we can be left grasping for a why. Why, Jesus? Why did you choose them? Why did you choose fishermen? Well, if it's not their qualifications or prereqs that sets them apart, if that isn't the reason, then maybe we should look at it from the other angle, from the opposite perspective. Maybe it's their very lack of qualifications. Maybe it's their very lack of fulfilling the prereqs. Perhaps that's the reason Jesus chose them to be his disciples. Maybe that's the point for this group of disciples. Why them? Because if they can do it, if fishermen can do it, then anyone can. Then we can. Then you can. We can be Jesus' followers too. Jesus calling these disciples, these fishermen, him going with a no prereqs approach proves that Jesus is ready and willing to call anyone, even you, even me. I think Jesus wanted to be clear. There are not a lot of prereqs to following him. In fact, there are no prereqs to following Jesus. There's nothing you have to do prior to or to qualify to be Jesus' followers. You just have to get up and go. One way I've heard other preachers describe this is that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. Right? God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. That's what he did for these fishermen. He goes with a no prereqs approach. And I'm convinced one of the reasons is to show that following Jesus is a possibility for all of us. The path of discipleship is open to all of us, including me and you. The lack of prereqs also emphasizes that discipleship is not about us. It's about him. It's about Jesus. It's about his power to transform us, about his ability to transform our inability. Jesus doesn't seek those. He doesn't only seek those who've checked all the right boxes, who have all the right prereqs. He doesn't say, in order to be my disciple or my follower, first you have to do this and make sure you do this. He doesn't do any of that. He doesn't ask for your resume. He's not looking for perfect candidates. Instead, he goes with a no prereqs approach. Aren't you glad? Because that's good news. That is gospel good news, because none of us are worthy. If there were a list of prereqs to be following Jesus, to be his follower, to be his disciple, none of us, not even the best and brightest among us, could fulfill that list. I wonder, maybe you've been told before that in some area of life you were lacking, that you weren't good enough. Maybe it was something with school. Maybe there was a prereq that you never accomplished to get into the class you wanted to take. Or maybe it had to do with a job. Maybe there was a job, a position that you were never quite qualified for. Your resume wasn't quite good enough. Your experience didn't quite match up, or you didn't wow in the interview. Or maybe it was something with sports, right? Maybe you didn't make the team because you weren't seen as athletic enough, or committed enough, or you didn't have the right connections. Might have been a peer group that you never quite fit in with, you never felt accepted by. Or it could be that there's someone in your life that no matter what you do, doesn't seem like it's good enough for them. Our world is filled with areas and places and people that are going to tell us that we aren't good enough. Places where we can be told over and over again, we're not good enough, we don't qualify, we don't fit the prereqs, or we don't have the prereqs. That's not the way it is with Jesus and his kingdom. Jesus has a no prereqs policy, no prerequisites required. And the good news, in addition to that, is that Jesus is calling. He's calling you. And there's not a whole lot of list of things that you need to do before you respond. You just need to respond and follow him. I asked you earlier to imagine what it would be like if Jesus were looking for disciples today and he came to you and asked, help me find disciples. The truth is, Jesus is looking for disciples today. And the truth is, he still doesn't have a list of prereqs that need to be filled in order to qualify to be his follower. He's calling you. He's saying, come, follow me. So church, let's come and follow Jesus. Amen? Amen. I hope you come and join us for our Zoom at 10 a.m. on Sunday, and we will be praying for you and for our country and for our world. Blessings to you.